On a sweltering summer night in 2008, the Johnson family's Chevy Tahoe vanished from the quiet streets of Stillwater, Oklahoma, leaving only tire tracks in the red dirt. 4 days later, police recovered the SUV from Keystone Lake, but the family of 4, parents and twin daughters, were nowhere to be found. 14 years passed before a college student's documentary project would accidentally unearth evidence that would shock the community. The neighbor everyone trusted, the man who organized search parties and consoled relatives, had been harboring the darkest secret all along. Each clue, from discarded receipts to forgotten security footage, would slowly piece together a tale of jealousy, rage, and calculated deception that had fooled an entire town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. On July 17, 2008, Stillwater, Oklahoma shimmered under an oppressive heat wave. The temperature had climbed to 103 degrees by mid-afternoon, the air thick with humidity as thunderheads gathered on the horizon, promising relief that wouldn't come until nightfall. The streets were quiet, most residents retreating indoors to the comfort of air conditioning. In a modest 2-story home on Oak Ridge Drive, the Johnson family prepared for a weekend getaway to Lake Eufaula. Robert Johnson, 42, a respected petroleum engineer at the local oil company, methodically packed fishing gear into their silver 2007 Chevy Tahoe. His wife Sarah, 39, an elementary school art teacher known for her vibrant classroom murals, sorted through a cooler of snacks and drinks. Their 10-year-old twin daughters, Emma and Lily, raced excitedly between the house and driveway, carrying pillows and their favorite books for the 3-hour drive. Neighbors would later recall the ordinary scene, Robert's meticulous packing, Sarah's gentle reminders to the girls about forgotten items, and the twins' infectious laughter echoing down the street. None suspected this mundane summer ritual would become the last memory anyone would have of the Johnson family alive. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the Johnsons locked their front door. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera captured Robert loading the last bag into the Tahoe's trunk, wiping sweat from his brow as he closed the hatch. Sarah helped the twins buckle into the back seat, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that caught the golden evening light. Robert started the engine, the low rumble breaking through the cricket-filled silence as they pulled away from the cul-de-sac. The silver Tahoe drove past the neighborhood pond, turned onto Western Avenue, and disappeared into the approaching storm. That brief, grainy footage would become the first piece of evidence in one of Oklahoma's most baffling missing persons cases. As the Johnsons headed southeast toward their lake cabin, they stopped at the Frontier gas station on the edge of town. The station's surveillance system recorded them at 7:52 p.m. Robert filled the tank while Sarah took the girls inside for bathroom breaks and to purchase bottles of water and candy. The cashier, Darlene Winters, remembered the family clearly. The twins were so excited, talking over each other about fishing and swimming, she later told detectives. Sarah seemed tired but happy. Nothing unusual. Just a normal family heading out for a weekend trip. This casual observation would be the last confirmed sighting of the Johnson family by anyone who knew them. At 9:18 p.m., highway patrol cameras caught the silver Tahoe passing through Okmulgee, following the expected route toward Lake Eufaula. Then, without explanation, the Johnsons' digital footprint vanished. No credit card transactions. No cell phone pings. No highway camera sightings. The family and their vehicle had seemingly evaporated into the storm-filled night. When the Johnsons failed to return for work and school on Monday, Sarah's sister, Melissa Crawford, grew concerned. Her calls went straight to voicemail. By Tuesday morning, July 22, she drove to their house, finding it locked, undisturbed, and empty. Panic rising, Melissa called the Stillwater Police Department. "My sister's family hasn't come home," she reported, voice trembling. "They should have been back Sunday night. No one has heard from them. This isn't like them at all." Officer James Reynolds took the initial report, noting that adults had the right to disappear if they chose. But the inclusion of children shifted his perspective immediately. By Tuesday afternoon, the Oklahoma Highway Patrol had issued a statewide alert for the missing silver Tahoe and its 4 occupants. The first 48 hours of the investigation proceeded with urgency but yielded little. Cell phone records confirmed the family's phones had all lost signal around 9:30 p.m. on July 17, somewhere in the vicinity of Henrietta. Credit card records showed no activity after the Frontier gas station purchase. The lake cabin stood empty, with no signs anyone had arrived that weekend. On the evening of July 21, as lightning split the sky over Stillwater, Chief Detective Marcus Tate called a briefing at police headquarters. Maps of eastern Oklahoma covered a large whiteboard, red lines tracing the Johnsons' known route. Officers and volunteers had searched roadsides, checked hospitals, and canvassed rest stops along Highway 75, finding nothing. "We're looking at 3 scenarios," Tate announced to the room of tired officers. 1. An accident. 2. They decided to go somewhere else without telling anyone. 3. Foul play. The grim silence that followed acknowledged what everyone feared most. As hours stretched into days, the likelihood of finding the family alive diminished rapidly. The breakthrough came on July 22, 4 days after the disappearance. A state police helicopter, scanning Keystone Lake west of Tulsa, miles off the expected route, spotted what appeared to be an oil slick in disturbed vegetation near a remote boat ramp. Dive teams were dispatched immediately. By nightfall, divers had located and recovered the Johnsons' silver Tahoe from 12 feet of muddy water. The SUV's windows were intact, the doors closed. Inside, investigators found the family's luggage, fishing gear, and the twins' backpacks, but no sign of Robert, Sarah, Emma, or Lily. The discovery only deepened the mystery. Forensic analysis of the vehicle raised disturbing questions. There was no damage consistent with an accident. The keys were still in the ignition. Most baffling, the Tahoe had been deliberately driven into the lake. Tire tracks showed a straight path from the boat ramp into the water. This wasn't a tragic mishap, someone had intentionally sunk the SUV. News of the recovered vehicle exploded across Oklahoma. Local stations interrupted programming with breaking updates. The Stillwater Press-Times ran a front-page headline, "Johnson Family SUV Found in Lake, Family Still Missing." Social media groups formed, coordinating volunteer searches of the shoreline and surrounding woods. The community rallied with a determination born of small-town solidarity. Melissa Crawford appeared on local television, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Please," she pleaded, "if anyone saw anything, anything at all, call the police. We just want to bring them home." Her raw emotion galvanized the public, and tips flooded the police hotline, most well-intentioned but unhelpful. With the discovery of the vehicle, the investigation shifted from missing persons to potential homicide. Crime scene technicians processed the Tahoe meticulously. Waterlogged evidence bags filled with sodden papers, children's toys, and vacation supplies were carefully documented and preserved. 2 critical pieces of evidence emerged, a partial bloody fingerprint on the steering wheel and traces of an accelerant on the gas pedal. Dive teams expanded their search around the lake, using sonar to scan the murky depths. For 5 consecutive days, they found nothing but debris and abandoned fishing gear. On July 29, the 7th day of diving, a diver discovered a woman's tennis shoe caught in submerged branches 50 yards from where the vehicle had been recovered. DNA testing would later confirm it belonged to Sarah Johnson. As July turned to August, the investigation seemed to stall. The fingerprint on the steering wheel proved inconclusive, too degraded by water to provide a definitive match. The accelerant was common lighter fluid, available at any convenience store. Despite hundreds of interviews and searches, no bodies were recovered, and no witnesses came forward with useful information. Throughout these fruitless weeks, one figure became increasingly prominent in the community response: Gregory Walsh, the Johnsons' next-door neighbor. At 47, Walsh was a respected local businessman who owned a hardware store in downtown Stillwater. Divorced with no children, he had lived beside the Johnsons for 6 years. In the wake of their disappearance, Walsh emerged as the family's most vocal advocate. He organized volunteer searches, printed thousands of flyers, and established the Find the Johnsons Facebook group that quickly gained 15,000 members. Walsh appeared regularly on local news, his earnest face and passionate pleas becoming familiar to Oklahomans. He even established a reward fund that raised over $50,000 for information leading to the family's whereabouts. Robert and Sarah weren't just neighbors, Walsh told reporters, voice cracking with emotion. They were friends. Those little girls used to bring me cookies. I won't rest until we know what happened to them. His dedication impressed both the community and investigators. Detective Tate noted in his case log, Walsh's assistance has been invaluable. His knowledge of the family and community connections have opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. By mid-August, with no new leads, the case began the sad transition from breaking news to cold case. The volunteer searches dwindled. Media coverage waned. The Find the Johnsons Facebook page still posted daily updates, but comments and shares decreased steadily. Even Melissa Crawford, though devastated, had to return to her job and children in Tulsa. The investigation never officially closed, but active pursuit of leads diminished as other cases demanded attention. Detective Tate kept the Johnson file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, convinced they had missed something crucial. By December 2008, the case had been featured on national true crime shows, but even this broader exposure generated no significant leads. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 5 years passed. The Johnson house stood empty, eventually sold by the bank after foreclosure. Gregory Walsh continued to maintain the memorial garden he'd planted between their properties, featuring 4 rose bushes, one for each missing family member. On the anniversary of their disappearance each year, he organized a candlelight vigil that drew increasingly smaller crowds. To many, the Johnsons became a tragic local legend, their fate one of Stillwater's unsolved mysteries. Detective Tate retired in 2013, passing the Johnson file to younger officers who reviewed it dutifully but without the personal investment he had shown. The case might have remained forever unsolved if not for an unexpected development in September 2022, 14 years after the disappearance. Emma Mitchell, a film student at Oklahoma State University, chose the Johnson case for her documentary thesis. Though only 8 years old when the family vanished, she had grown up hearing the story and felt drawn to it. With no connection to the family, she approached the project with fresh eyes and modern perspective. For 3 months, Mitchell interviewed everyone connected to the case, retired officers, former neighbors, Melissa Crawford, and Gregory Walsh, who had become the unofficial keeper of the Johnson family's memory. She dug through newspaper archives, police reports released under Freedom of Information requests, and hours of news footage. While researching at the Stillwater Historical Society, Mitchell discovered an overlooked detail. In July 2008, the Frontier gas station had upgraded its security system just days before the Johnsons disappeared. The police had reviewed the interior footage showing the family's last stop, but Mitchell found a mention of additional exterior cameras that had been installed but weren't yet properly calibrated. Curious, she tracked down the former security company owner, now running a cybersecurity firm in Oklahoma City. After explaining her project, he searched his archived files and found something remarkable: backup footage from those exterior cameras. Though the police had deemed the blurry nighttime images unusable in 2008, modern enhancement technology might yield better results. Mitchell took the footage to the university's digital forensics lab. Professor Harlan Jenkins, intrigued by the cold case, agreed to help. Using advanced software unavailable in 2008, they enhanced and stabilized the grainy video. What emerged sent shockwaves through everyone involved. The enhanced footage showed not only the Johnsons at the gas station but also a dark pickup truck parked at the edge of the property. As the family pulled away, the truck followed. Most significantly, when they zoomed in on the driver, the face was partially visible and unmistakably belonged to Gregory Walsh. Mitchell immediately took the enhanced video to the Stillwater Police Department. Detective Amber Longtree, who had inherited the case file, reviewed the footage with growing alarm. Walsh had consistently claimed he was home alone the night of July 17, 2008, watching a baseball game on television. Yet here he was, clearly following the Johnson family as they left town. This doesn't necessarily prove anything criminal, Detective Longtree cautioned. But it's certainly a discrepancy we need to explore. The investigation reopened with quiet intensity. Rather than confronting Walsh immediately, Longtree began re-examining his involvement from the beginning. His prominent role in the search efforts, his maintenance of the memorial, his close relationship with the family, all took on a potentially sinister new dimension. Detectives discreetly interviewed Walsh's ex-wife, who had moved to Dallas years earlier. What she revealed was disturbing. Greg always had an unusual fixation on Sarah Johnson, she confided. He would mention her in conversation constantly. How talented she was. How she deserved better than Robert. I actually left him partly because of his obsession with her. This revelation prompted a deeper background investigation. Financial records showed Walsh's hardware store had been struggling in 2008, with mounting debt and declining sales. More significantly, he had taken out a large life insurance policy on Robert Johnson just 6 months before the disappearance, a business partnership arrangement that Walsh had never mentioned during the investigation. Armed with mounting circumstantial evidence, Detective Longtree obtained warrants to search Walsh's home and business. On October 18, 2022, police arrived at the downtown hardware store, closing it to customers while forensic teams began their methodical examination. Simultaneously, another team entered Walsh's house, the same property he'd lived in for 20 years, right next door to the Johnsons' former home. The house search initially yielded nothing suspicious until investigators reached the detached garage. Behind stacked boxes and beneath old carpeting, they discovered a hidden trapdoor leading to a small cellar, an unusual feature not included in the property's blueprints. Inside this secret room were plastic totes containing items that made the seasoned investigators fall silent: Sarah Johnson's purse, still containing her driver's license. The twins' favorite stuffed animals. Robert's watch and wedding ring. Most damning of all, a journal in Walsh's handwriting detailing his obsession with Sarah and his growing hatred for Robert. The final entry, dated July 17, 2008, read simply, "Tonight, I save her from him. Tonight, she'll finally understand." While the search continued, officers located Walsh at his sister's home across town and brought him in for questioning. For hours, he maintained his innocence, expressing shock at the planted evidence and suggesting he was being framed. When confronted with the enhanced gas station footage, however, his composure cracked. "You don't understand," he whispered, eyes fixed on the grainy image of himself following the Johnsons' Tahoe. "I loved her. Robert wasn't good enough. He didn't appreciate what he had." Over the next 12 hours, Walsh's confession emerged in fragments. He had indeed followed the family that night, using the approaching storm as cover. When they pulled over at a rest stop near Henrietta, he confronted Robert, claiming he needed to speak with him about an urgent business matter. The confrontation escalated to violence. In Walsh's telling, Robert attacked him first, forcing him to defend himself. The medical examiner would later dispute this account based on forensic evidence. What happened next was calculated and cold-blooded. Walsh, realizing he had gone too far, decided to eliminate all witnesses. He forced Sarah and the twins into his truck at gunpoint, drove Robert's body and the others to a remote area near Keystone Lake, and committed the unthinkable. He then drove the Tahoe into the lake to stage an accident, believing the rising storm waters would carry away all evidence. For 14 years, Walsh had lived next door to the crime scene, organizing searches he knew would find nothing, consoling family members he had robbed of their loved ones, and building a persona as the town's most dedicated advocate for a family he had destroyed. On October 20, 2022, Walsh led investigators to an abandoned oil field 20 miles from Keystone Lake. There, in a dry well covered with concrete, forensic teams recovered the remains of Robert, Sarah, Emma, and Lily Johnson. The discovery brought closure to a case that had haunted Oklahoma for more than a decade, but it opened wounds that many had thought long scarred over. The community's reaction was one of profound shock and betrayal. The man they had admired for his dedication and compassion was revealed as a monster hiding in plain sight. Neighbors recalled Walsh comforting Melissa Crawford at vigils, helping schoolchildren plant memorial trees, and giving passionate interviews about finding the family, all while knowing exactly where they were and what had happened to them. The arrest of Gregory Walsh sent shockwaves through Stillwater and across Oklahoma. News vans lined the courthouse square, their satellite dishes stretching skyward like mechanical trees. National outlets descended on the small college town, transforming the quiet community into the epicenter of a true crime sensation. For residents who had lived with the mystery for 14 years, the revelation was both validating and devastating. The truth had been hiding next door all along. On the morning of October 24, 2022, Walsh made his first court appearance. The Payne County Courthouse, a stately brick building that had witnessed a century of the town's history, was filled beyond capacity. Spectators lined up before dawn, desperate to glimpse the man who had deceived them all. Inside, Walsh sat motionless at the defendant's table, his once friendly face now gaunt and expressionless. When the judge read the charges, 4 counts of first-degree murder, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The most shocking aspect for many wasn't just the brutality of the crime, but the calculated deception that followed. For 14 years, Walsh had been living a double life, grieving neighbor by day, keeper of unimaginable secrets by night. Melissa Crawford, Sarah Johnson's sister, sat in the front row, her husband's arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. When Walsh turned during proceedings, their eyes met briefly. Witnesses would later describe the moment as electric, a silent confrontation between unimaginable loss and unfathomable betrayal. "I attended his vigils," Melissa later told reporters, her voice hollow with disbelief. "I hugged him. Thanked him for keeping their memory alive. All while he knew exactly what he'd done to them. There's no punishment sufficient for that kind of evil." The preliminary hearing revealed the meticulous nature of Walsh's deception. Prosecutors presented evidence that he had researched lake depths, police investigation techniques, and decomposition rates in the months leading up to the murders. His computer history showed searches for perfect murder and how to make a body disappear permanently. Most disturbing was the revelation that Walsh had built the hidden cellar specifically to store mementos from the Johnson family. Construction receipts showed he had hired contractors to dig the space 6 months before the murders, telling workers it was for wine storage. The shelving where he had kept the family's belongings was custom-built, each space seemingly designed for specific items. As winter settled over Oklahoma, the state prosecutor announced they would seek the death penalty. The declaration divided the community. Some argued that anything less would be an injustice to the Johnson family, while others questioned whether even execution could bring true closure after so many years of lies. Throughout the pre-trial proceedings, one figure emerged as unexpectedly pivotal: Emma Mitchell, the film student whose documentary project had cracked the case wide open. Initially planning to document a cold case, she now found herself central to its resolution. Prosecutors consulted her frequently, drawing on her extensive research and the connections she'd made while investigating. Mitchell's perspective was unique. She had interviewed Walsh extensively for her project, unknowingly giving him a platform to perpetuate his charade. Footage of these interviews, showing Walsh tearfully recounting his friendship with the Johnsons, became key evidence of his calculated deception. "When I watch those interviews now, knowing what we know, it's chilling," Mitchell told the Stillwater Press-Times. "He spoke about them with such conviction, such apparent love. He even cried when talking about the twins. How does someone compartmentalize like that? How do you cry on camera about people you murdered?" The question haunted Stillwater. Psychologists and true crime enthusiasts offered theories about Walsh's mental state, but for those who had known him, shared meals with him, worked alongside him, trusted him, no explanation seemed sufficient. In January 2023, as the case prepared for trial, Detective Amber Longtree decided to re-examine all evidence from the original investigation with fresh eyes. Her team revisited every statement, photo, and report from 2008, looking for missed clues that might have revealed Walsh's involvement earlier. One name caught Longtree's attention: Daniel Foster, a mechanic who had worked briefly at Walsh's hardware store in 2008. Foster had been interviewed superficially during the original investigation but had since moved to Alaska. After tracking him down, Longtree conducted a video interview that proved revelatory. "I only worked for Greg for about 3 months," Foster explained, his breath visible in the Alaskan cold as he spoke from his garage. "I quit right after the Johnsons went missing. Something felt off about him during that time." Foster described returning to the store after hours on July 18, 2008, the day after the disappearance, to retrieve tools he had forgotten. He found Walsh in the back office, burning papers in a metal trash can. "When he saw me, he jumped like he'd seen a ghost," Foster recalled. Said he was destroying old invoices, "but I remember seeing something else in the fire, looked like photographs. I didn't think much of it then, with everything going on with the missing family. But looking back, man, I should have said something sooner." This new testimony provided crucial context but no physical evidence. That changed when Longtree ordered a new search of Walsh's hardware store, focusing specifically on the office Foster had mentioned. Behind a loose brick in the wall, forensic technicians discovered a thumb drive wrapped in plastic. The drive contained hundreds of photos of Sarah Johnson and her daughters, taken without their knowledge. Images of Sarah gardening, shopping downtown, teaching at the elementary school. Pictures of the twins playing in their backyard, waiting at the bus stop, riding bikes in the neighborhood. The metadata showed some photos dated back to 2005, 3 years before the murders. When this evidence was presented at a pre-trial hearing in March 2023, even Walsh's defense attorney seemed shaken. The surveillance wasn't just invasive, it demonstrated the depth and duration of his obsession. The prosecution argued it proved premeditation extending far beyond what they'd initially realized. Public sentiment, already strongly against Walsh, hardened further. The hardware store, which had remained closed since his arrest, was vandalized repeatedly despite police protection. Someone painted "Monster" across the front window in red. Another night, a small fire was set at the rear entrance, quickly extinguished but symbolically significant. The community wanted to purge itself of his presence. As summer approached, bringing the 15th anniversary of the Johnsons' disappearance, Stillwater struggled with how to commemorate the occasion. The memorial garden Walsh had maintained now stood overgrown and abandoned. School officials debated what to do with the playground equipment dedicated to the twins. Even the annual vigil, tainted by Walsh's involvement, seemed impossible to continue in its previous form. Melissa Crawford proposed a new approach, a community healing event rather than a somber vigil. "We've had 15 years of mourning without closure," she explained to the city council. "Now that we know what happened, now that they've been found and properly laid to rest, it's time to transform our grief into something constructive." On July 17, 2023, exactly 15 years after the murders, hundreds gathered at Boomer Lake Park. Instead of candles, they planted native wildflowers. Instead of speeches about loss, community leaders spoke about resilience and truth. For oak saplings, symbols of strength and endurance, were planted in a diamond formation, one for each Johnson family member. Emma Mitchell attended, now working with a production company to expand her student documentary into a feature-length film. The project had evolved from examining a cold case to exploring a community's journey through deception, discovery, and healing. "What happened to the Johnsons is a tragedy beyond words," Mitchell told attendees. "But what's happening here today, this transformation of pain into growth, that's something worth documenting. That's the story Stillwater deserves to be known for." Behind the scenes, trial preparations intensified. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Victoria Reeves, assembled a case built on 3 pillars: the physical evidence from Walsh's property, his documented obsession with Sarah, and the elaborate cover-up that followed the murders. The defense, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence, began exploring a mental health strategy, suggesting Walsh had suffered a psychotic break. In August 2023, a significant development shifted the case dramatically. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the forensic psychiatrist evaluating Walsh, submitted her report to the court. After extensive interviews and testing, she concluded that while Walsh showed narcissistic tendencies and antisocial behaviors, he did not meet the criteria for legal insanity. More importantly, she determined his actions showed clear awareness of wrongdoing and deliberate efforts to avoid consequences. The defendant's behavior before, during, and after the criminal acts demonstrates sophisticated planning, awareness of social norms, and conscious efforts to mislead authorities, Dr. Winters wrote. These are not the actions of someone disconnected from reality, but rather someone actively manipulating it. This evaluation effectively eliminated the possibility of an insanity defense. Walsh's attorney pivoted to negotiations for a plea deal, hoping to avoid the death penalty. D.A. Reeves, after consulting with Melissa Crawford and other Johnson relatives, presented terms: life imprisonment without parole in exchange for a full confession detailing exactly what happened that night in 2008. On September 12, 2023, Walsh accepted the plea deal. The courtroom was packed for what? Bring true closure after so many years of lies. Throughout the pre-trial proceedings, one figure emerged as unexpectedly pivotal: Emma Mitchell, the film student whose documentary project had cracked the case wide open. Initially planning to document a cold case, she now found herself central to its resolution. Prosecutors consulted her frequently, drawing on her extensive research and the connections she'd made while investigating. Mitchell's perspective was unique. She had interviewed Walsh extensively for her project, unknowingly giving him a platform to perpetuate his charade. Footage of these interviews, showing Walsh tearfully recounting his friendship with the Johnsons, became key evidence of his calculated deception. When I watch those interviews now, knowing what we know, it's chilling, Mitchell told the Stillwater Press-Times. He spoke about them with such conviction, such apparent love. He even cried when talking about the twins. How does someone compartmentalize like that? How do you cry on camera about people you murdered? The question haunted Stillwater. Psychologists and true crime enthusiasts offered theories about Walsh's mental state, but for those who had known him, shared meals with him, worked alongside him, trusted him, no explanation seemed sufficient. In January 2023, as the case prepared for trial, Detective Amber Longtree decided to re-examine all evidence from the original investigation with fresh eyes. Her team revisited every statement, photo, and report from 2008, looking for missed clues that might have revealed Walsh's involvement earlier. One name caught Longtree's attention: Daniel Foster, a mechanic who had worked briefly at Walsh's hardware store in 2008. Foster had been interviewed superficially during the original investigation but had since moved to Alaska. After tracking him down, Longtree conducted a video interview that proved revelatory. "I only worked for Greg for about 3 months, Foster explained, his breath visible in the Alaskan cold as he spoke from his garage. "I quit right after the Johnsons went missing. Something felt off about him during that time." Foster described returning to the store after hours on July 18, 2008, the day after the disappearance, to retrieve tools he had forgotten. He found Walsh in the back office, burning papers in a metal trash can. "When he saw me, he jumped like he'd seen a ghost," Foster recalled. Said he was destroying old invoices, but I remember seeing something else in the fire, looked like photographs. I didn't think much of it then, with everything going on with the missing family. But looking back, man, I should have said something sooner. This new testimony provided crucial context but no physical evidence. That changed when Longtree ordered a new search of Walsh's hardware store, focusing specifically on the office Foster had mentioned. Behind a loose brick in the wall, forensic technicians discovered a thumb drive wrapped in plastic. The drive contained hundreds of photos of Sarah Johnson and her daughters, taken without their knowledge. Images of Sarah gardening, shopping downtown, teaching at the elementary school. Pictures of the twins playing in their backyard, waiting at the bus stop, riding bikes in the neighborhood. The metadata showed some photos dated back to 2005, 3 years before the murders. When this evidence was presented at a pre-trial hearing in March 2023, even Walsh's defense attorney seemed shaken. The surveillance wasn't just invasive, it demonstrated the depth and duration of his obsession. The prosecution argued it proved premeditation extending far beyond what they'd initially realized. Public sentiment, already strongly against Walsh, hardened further. The hardware store, which had remained closed since his arrest, was vandalized repeatedly despite police protection. Someone painted "Monster" across the front window in red. Another night, a small fire was set at the rear entrance, quickly extinguished but symbolically significant. The community wanted to purge itself of his presence. As summer approached, bringing the 15th anniversary of the Johnsons' disappearance, Stillwater struggled with how to commemorate the occasion. The memorial garden Walsh had maintained now stood overgrown and abandoned. School officials debated what to do with the playground equipment dedicated to the twins. Even the annual vigil, tainted by Walsh's involvement, seemed impossible to continue in its previous form. Melissa Crawford proposed a new approach, a community healing event rather than a somber vigil. "We've had 15 years of mourning without closure," she explained to the city council. "Now that we know what happened, now that they've been found and properly laid to rest, it's time to transform our grief into something constructive." On July 17, 2023, exactly 15 years after the murders, hundreds gathered at Boomer Lake Park. Instead of candles, they planted native wildflowers. Instead of speeches about loss, community leaders spoke about resilience and truth. For oak saplings, symbols of strength and endurance, were planted in a diamond formation, one for each Johnson family member. Emma Mitchell attended, now working with a production company to expand her student documentary into a feature-length film. The project had evolved from examining a cold case to exploring a community's journey through deception, discovery, and healing. "What happened to the Johnsons is a tragedy beyond words," Mitchell told attendees. "But what's happening here today, this transformation of pain into growth, that's something worth documenting. That's the story Stillwater deserves to be known for." Behind the scenes, trial preparations intensified. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Victoria Reeves, assembled a case built on 3 pillars: the physical evidence from Walsh's property, his documented obsession with Sarah, and the elaborate cover-up that followed the murders. The defense, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence, began exploring a mental health strategy, suggesting Walsh had suffered a psychotic break. In August 2023, a significant development shifted the case dramatically. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the forensic psychiatrist evaluating Walsh, submitted her report to the court. After extensive interviews and testing, she concluded that while Walsh showed narcissistic tendencies and antisocial behaviors, he did not meet the criteria for legal insanity. More importantly, she determined his actions showed clear awareness of wrongdoing and deliberate efforts to avoid consequences. The defendant's behavior before, during, and after the criminal acts demonstrates sophisticated planning, awareness of social norms, and conscious efforts to mislead authorities, Dr. Winters wrote. "These are not the actions of someone disconnected from reality, but rather someone actively manipulating it." This evaluation effectively eliminated the possibility of an insanity defense. Walsh's attorney pivoted to negotiations for a plea deal, hoping to avoid the death penalty. DA Reeves, after consulting with Melissa Crawford and other Johnson relatives, presented terms: life imprisonment without parole in exchange for a full confession detailing exactly what happened that night in 2008. On September 12, 2023, Walsh accepted the plea deal. The courtroom was packed for what many expected to be a dramatic confession, a moment of truth after 15 years of lies. Instead, Walsh delivered a statement so clinical and devoid of emotion that it stunned those present. He described following the Johnsons from the gas station, forcing them to pull over by flashing his high beams and pretending to have urgent business with Robert. He recounted attacking Robert when they were briefly alone, striking him with a tire iron before hiding the body in his truck. Then he described returning to Sarah and the twins, claiming he was helping them look for Robert, who he said had wandered into the woods feeling ill. Walsh detailed driving the family to the abandoned oil field, Sarah growing increasingly suspicious during the journey. Upon arrival, he admitted executing his plan methodically, starting with Sarah to prevent her from protecting the children. His description of the twins' final moments was so horrific that the judge had to call a recess when several jurors and spectators became physically ill. The most chilling aspect was Walsh's explanation for the 14-year charade that followed. He described it not as a cover-up born of fear or panic, but as an extension of his connection to Sarah. By being the one who cared the most about finding them, he stated flatly, I could keep her close to me. Everyone would associate me with Sarah forever. They'd see me and think of her. It was the next best thing to having her. When Walsh finished, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if his words had frozen the air itself. Judge Martha Holbrook finally broke the silence, her voice tight with controlled emotion. In 30 years on the bench, she said, I have never witnessed such a complete absence of human empathy. Mr. Walsh, the court accepts your plea in the agreed-upon sentence, not because it represents justice, no punishment could, but because it guarantees you will never again walk free among decent people. The sentence was formalized, for consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Walsh would be sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister, housed in administrative segregation for his own protection from other inmates. As guards led him away, Melissa Crawford stood. Greg, she called out, her voice steady. Walsh paused but didn't turn. They found happiness without you. Remember that. Every day for the rest of your life, remember that. With Walsh's case resolved, Stillwater began the long process of reconciliation with its own history. The town had to confront uncomfortable questions. How had they missed the signs? How had Walsh's obsession flourished undetected? Why had the original investigation overlooked critical evidence? Detective Tate, who had led the initial investigation in 2008, came out of retirement to address these questions publicly. In a town hall meeting that October, he acknowledged the failures of the original case. We followed procedure, he admitted to the crowded auditorium. But procedure isn't always enough. We didn't look closely enough at those closest to the family. We accepted Walsh's alibi without sufficient verification. When the car was found in Keystone Lake, we focused our search there, never considering it might be a deliberate misdirection. Tate's candor was painful but necessary. It prompted the Stillwater Police Department to review protocols for missing persons cases, particularly those involving children. Chief Raymond instituted new training programs focused on forensic psychology and investigating familiar suspects, those within the victim's close circles. The Johnson case teaches us that sometimes the most dedicated searcher is the one who knows exactly why nothing will be found, Chief Raymond told his officers. We cannot make assumptions based on someone's public persona or community standing. As winter returned to Oklahoma, Emma Mitchell completed her documentary, now titled The Neighbor, Stillwater's Betrayal and Redemption. The film premiered at a small independent theater in Oklahoma City, with many Stillwater residents attending, including Detective Longtree, Melissa Crawford, and the forensic team who had processed the crucial evidence. The documentary did more than recount the case, it examined how communities process trauma and rebuild trust after profound betrayal. The final scenes showed the memorial oaks at Boomer Lake Park, their young branches reaching skyward, surrounded by wildflowers planted during the community healing event. Stillwater will always carry the Johnson family in its heart, the narrator concluded. But now, it carries something else too, the knowledge that truth, no matter how long buried, eventually finds its way to the light. The film received critical acclaim and was acquired by a major streaming service, bringing national attention to both the case and the community's response to it. For many residents, seeing their town's darkest chapter examined with compassion rather than sensationalism was a turning point in the healing process. In January 2024, the Johnson case brought about legislative change. Oklahoma lawmakers, moved by the circumstances of the case, passed the Johnson Family Act, which established new protocols for missing persons investigations involving entire families. The law mandated enhanced background checks on close associates, required preservation of all potential electronic evidence for a minimum of 20 years, and established a specialized task force for cold case reviews. At the signing ceremony, Governor Marshall acknowledged Melissa Crawford and Detective Longtree for their advocacy. Some laws are written in ink, the governor said. But this one was written first in tears and perseverance. The Johnson family's legacy will now protect other families across our state. As the one-year anniversary of Walsh's confession approached, Stillwater had begun to reclaim its identity beyond the tragedy. The elementary school where Sarah had taught dedicated a new art studio in her name. The oil company where Robert had worked established scholarships for engineering students at Oklahoma State University. The twins' former classmates, now adults, organized an annual children's literacy program in their memory. Detective Amber Longtree, whose determination had been crucial in solving the case, received the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation's highest honor. In her acceptance speech, she emphasized the collaborative nature of cold case work. "This wasn't my solving alone," she insisted. "It was Emma Mitchell asking questions with fresh eyes. It was forensic technicians applying new technology to old evidence. It was witnesses finding courage to share overlooked details. And most of all, it was Melissa Crawford refusing to let her family be forgotten." For Melissa, the year had brought a complex mixture of grief and relief. Having finally laid her sister and her family to rest properly, she focused on ensuring their memory inspired positive change. She established the Johnson Family Foundation, which supported both victims of violent crime and innovations in investigative techniques for cold cases. Sarah was a creator, Melissa explained during a foundation event. She made art that brought joy to her students. Robert engineered solutions to difficult problems. The twins were just beginning to discover their own gifts. "I can't bring them back, but I can make sure their lives continue to create positive ripples in this world." The Foundation's first major initiative funded advanced training for law enforcement and digital forensics, the very technology that had enhanced the gas station footage and broken the case. The program specifically targeted rural police departments with limited resources, ensuring that smaller communities would have access to the same investigative tools as major metropolitan areas. On a crisp afternoon in March 2024, Emma Mitchell visited Keystone Lake, where the Johnsons' empty vehicle had been discovered 16 years earlier. She stood on the shore, camera in hand, capturing the play of light on water for the epilogue of an expanded version of her documentary. A fisherman approached, curious about her filming. When she explained the connection to the Johnson case, he nodded solemnly. "I was part of the volunteer search back then," he revealed. "Spent 3 days combing these shores. Never thought they'd be found at an old oil field miles away. Never imagined Walsh was behind it all." Mitchell asked him how the community had changed since the truth came out. The man considered this, looking out over the water. "We're more watchful now," he finally said. "Not in a paranoid way. Just more present. We pay attention to each other. Notice when something seems off. I think we understand now that caring about your neighbors means truly seeing them, the real them, not just the face they show the world." His insight captured what many in Stillwater felt but struggled to articulate. The case had transformed the community's understanding of itself. The discovery that evil had hidden behind a mask of extraordinary compassion had made them value authentic connection over performative concern. As spring returned to Oklahoma in 2024, the 4 oak saplings at Boomer Lake Park produced their first new leaves, bright green symbols of continuance after dormancy. Stillwater residents often walked the memorial path, some leaving small tokens, others simply sitting on nearby benches in quiet contemplation. One visitor became a regular fixture, Daniel Foster, the former hardware store employee whose testimony about Walsh burning photographs had proven significant. After 16 years in Alaska, Foster had returned to Oklahoma, haunted by the feeling that he should have recognized Walsh's strange behavior sooner. "I keep thinking I could have prevented it," he confided to Detective Longtree during a chance meeting at the memorial. "If I'd reported what I saw that night, maybe they would have looked at him more closely." Longtree shook her head. "That kind of thinking will eat you alive," she told him. "Walsh fooled everyone, friends, neighbors, police, the whole town. He was deliberate and careful. You noticed something off and remembered it years later when it mattered. That helped bring him to justice." Foster nodded, not entirely convinced but somewhat comforted. "I'm thinking of staying," he said after a moment. "Stillwater feels different now. Like it's learned something important." This sentiment echoed through many conversations that spring. Residents spoke of a before and after, not just related to the crime itself, but to how they understood their community. The town had faced the darkest aspects of human nature and emerged with a deeper commitment to vigilance, truth, and genuine connection. In May 2024, Oklahoma State University's Psychology Department hosted a symposium titled Deception, Detection, and Community Healing: Lessons from the Johnson Case. The event brought together law enforcement professionals, mental health experts, and community leaders from across the country to discuss the case's broader implications. Emma Mitchell presented clips from her documentary, focusing on interviews with residents about how they had processed Walsh's betrayal. One particularly powerful segment featured former members of the Find the Johnsons Facebook group discussing how their grief had been manipulated by the very man who caused it. "He used our compassion as camouflage," one woman observed. "That's the part I'm still struggling with, how our best instincts became his cover story." This recognition, that virtue itself could be weaponized by those with dark intentions, had profound implications for how communities approach tragedy. The symposium developed recommendations for maintaining appropriate skepticism even in emotional situations, ensuring that grief doesn't blind people to inconsistencies or warning signs. By summer 2024, as the Johnson case approached its 16th anniversary, Stillwater had established new traditions. The somber vigils once organized by Walsh had been replaced by the community healing event at Boomer Lake Park. Additionally, the elementary school held an annual art festival showcasing student work inspired by Sarah Johnson's teaching philosophy. In June, Melissa Crawford published a memoir titled Finding the Johnsons: A Sister's Journey Through Deception to Truth. The book detailed not only the family's disappearance and the long search, but also her personal process of reconciling with the brutal reality of what had happened. Critics praised its unflinching honesty and its insights into surviving unimaginable loss. "The hardest part wasn't learning they were murdered," Melissa wrote in one powerful passage. "The hardest part was realizing that for 14 years, I had embraced their murderer. I had accepted his comfort. I had been grateful for his dedication. Healing isn't just about accepting what happened to them, it's about forgiving myself for being deceived." The book became a national bestseller, bringing renewed attention to the case. Melissa used the platform to advocate for the Johnson Family Foundation's work, particularly its focus on supporting families navigating the aftermath of violent crime. At Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Gregory Walsh remained in administrative segregation, isolated from other inmates for his own protection. Prison officials reported he rarely spoke and refused most visitors. The only exception was a monthly visit from a prison chaplain, though guards noted these sessions typically ended quickly, with the chaplain often leaving visibly disturbed. Walsh had become what many considered a textbook case of malignant narcissism, studied by criminology students and forensic psychologists trying to understand how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. His case was incorporated into FBI training materials as an example of how killers can exploit community grief to establish alibis and deflect suspicion. As July 17, 2024, approached, marking 16 years since the murders and 2 years since the truth was discovered, Stillwater prepared for its second annual community healing event. The memorial oaks had grown noticeably, their root systems strengthening beneath the soil just as the community had developed deeper connections through shared recovery. Emma Mitchell returned to document the event for the updated version of her film. Now employed by a major documentary studio, she had become an advocate for cold case investigations nationwide, using her platform to highlight how modern technology and fresh perspectives. Forensic experts, and victims' advocates from across the country. The Johnson case was featured prominently, with presentations on how modern technology had reopened the investigation and how community involvement had proven crucial. FBI Special Agent Marquez, a specialist in behavioral analysis, delivered a keynote address analyzing Walsh's unusual post-crime behavior. "What made this case unique," he explained, was the perpetrator's decision to position himself at the center of the search efforts. Most killers distance themselves from their crimes, But Walsh did the opposite. He immersed himself in the investigation, the memorial efforts, the community grief. This allowed him to control the narrative and monitor the investigation's progress. The agent's presentation included a psychological profile of Walsh, identifying the narcissistic patterns that had driven both his obsession with Sarah and his subsequent performance as the grieving neighbor. The profile had been incorporated into FBI training materials as a case study in recognizing manipulative behaviors in witnesses and community members connected to investigations. Throughout the conference, Emma Mitchell's documentary was referenced repeatedly as an example of how fresh perspectives can break open cold cases. Mitchell herself participated in a panel discussion on the role of media in reviving public interest in unsolved crimes. "There's a fine line between exploitation and advocacy," she acknowledged. "I was constantly aware of that balance while making the film. The goal wasn't to sensationalize the Johnson family's tragedy but to humanize them, to ensure they weren't remembered just as victims but as individuals whose lives had meaning beyond how they ended." As April brought the first wildflowers to Boomer Lake Park, the memorial oak showed signs of thriving, their canopies expanding, roots deepening. Groundskeepers reported that visitors often left small tokens beneath the trees: children's drawings, handmade bracelets, poems written on biodegradable paper. The site had become a place of reflection for the community, a tangible reminder of both loss and renewal. On a particularly beautiful spring day, Detective Longtree visited the memorial with Daniel Foster, the former hardware store employee who had returned to Stillwater. They walked the path in companionable silence before stopping at a new addition to the site, a simple stone bench inscribed with Sarah's final journal entry and the words "Trust your instincts" beneath it. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," Foster commented, sitting on the bench. "About how Walsh fooled everyone and I shouldn't blame myself for not recognizing the signs sooner." Longtree nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I think I've finally started to accept that," he said. "But I've also realized something else. Back then, we all operated as individuals. If I felt uneasy about Walsh, I kept it to myself. If Sarah noticed him watching her family, she didn't have a clear path to report it. If the gas station attendant thought it was odd that Walsh followed them that night, she had no context for why that might be significant." Foster gestured around the park, where families were picnicking and children played. "But look at Stillwater now. We've learned to communicate, to connect those dots collectively. That's the real change I see." His observation captured something fundamental about the community's transformation. The Johnson case had taught Stillwater that safety wasn't just an individual responsibility but a collective one. Neighbors watched out for each other more conscientiously. Unusual behaviors were noted and discussed rather than dismissed. Resources existed for reporting concerns without feeling alarmist. In May 2025, as the third annual community healing event approached, Stillwater received news that Gregory Walsh had died in the prison medical facility. The announcement came without fanfare, a simple press release from the Department of Corrections noting the death of inmate number 732941 from complications of pancreatic cancer. Local media covered the news briefly, but notably, Walsh's death received far less attention than any previous development in the case. It seemed the community had already processed his role and moved on to focus on the Johnson family's legacy rather than their killer's fate. Melissa Crawford, when asked for comment, provided a single statement: "My focus remains on honoring my sister's family through the Foundation's work and ensuring that other families are protected through education and awareness. Beyond that, I have nothing to say about the man who took them from us." Her response reflected the community's general sentiment. Walsh had become irrelevant to the story Stillwater was now telling about itself, a story not of victimhood but of resilience, awareness, and connection. In June 2025, nearly 17 years after the Johnson family's disappearance, the Recognition and Response Program developed by the Johnson Family Foundation received federal funding to expand nationally. The curriculum, refined through implementation in Oklahoma schools and community centers, had demonstrated measurable success in helping people identify concerning behaviors and take appropriate action. At the announcement ceremony in Oklahoma City, Melissa shared the stage with Laura Simmons, who had become an advocate for stalking awareness after sharing her experience with Walsh. Together, they presented data showing that program participants were significantly more likely to report concerning behaviors and trust their instincts about potential dangers. "This is what justice looks like," Melissa told the audience. "Not just punishment for past crimes, but prevention of future ones. When I think about what Sarah would want her legacy to be, I'm certain it would be this: protecting other families from experiencing what happened to hers." As July 17, 2025 approached, the 17th anniversary of the murders and the 3rd anniversary of Walsh's arrest, Stillwater prepared for its annual community healing event with a focus on looking forward rather than back. The memorial at Boomer Lake Park had become an established part of the town's landscape, the 4 oak trees now tall enough to provide shade over the stone bench. Emma Mitchell returned once more, this time not to document the event but to participate in it. Her film had recently won a prestigious documentary award, bringing renewed national attention to both the case and the community's response to it. But for Mitchell, the greatest reward was seeing how the story had evolved from tragedy to inspiration. "When I started this project as a student, I thought I was documenting a cold case," she told local reporters. "What I ended up capturing was a community's transformation, from victims of deception to advocates for awareness. That's the story that matters now." On the morning of the anniversary, children from Stillwater Elementary School, where Sarah Johnson had once taught art, presented a special project at the memorial site. Each class had created panels for a mosaic installation that would stand near the oak trees. The panels depicted scenes of community connection, neighbors helping neighbors, children playing safely, families enjoying Stillwater's parks and public spaces. The school principal explained that the children had been asked to illustrate what made them feel safe in their community. Their artwork, colorful and hopeful, stood in stark contrast to the tragedy that had inspired the memorial, yet it felt like an appropriate evolution: darkness giving way to light, fear transformed into vigilance and care. As the community gathered that evening for the now traditional planting of wildflowers around the memorial, Detective Amber Longtree took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. Standing slightly apart from the crowd, she watched families working together, children carefully placing seedlings in prepared soil, neighbors chatting comfortably. Melissa Crawford approached, offering a small trowel. "You should plant one too," she suggested. "You're as much a part of this story as anyone." Longtree accepted the tool and knelt to add a purple coneflower to the growing garden. As she patted the soil around the seedling, she thought about the case that had defined her career and changed her community. She had entered law enforcement hoping to bring justice to victims, but the Johnson case had taught her that justice comes in many forms, sometimes through conviction and punishment, but more profoundly through healing and prevention. Standing again, she looked up at the oak trees, their branches reaching toward each other as they grew. In time, they would form a canopy, their separate root systems intertwining beneath the soil. It seemed a fitting metaphor for what Stillwater had become: individuals connected by both tragedy and resilience, stronger together than apart. As twilight settled over Boomer Lake Park, someone began to sing, a simple, hopeful melody that others gradually joined. The impromptu chorus spread through the gathered crowd, voices blending in the soft evening air. No one had planned this moment, but it felt right, a community finding its voice together, transforming remembrance into renewal. In the gathering darkness, small solar lights along the memorial path illuminated one by one. The inscription on Sarah Johnson's bench caught the gentle glow: "Trust your instincts." 3 simple words that had become Stillwater's guiding principle, a hard-won wisdom from an unimaginable loss. Melissa Crawford stood among her neighbors, her face peaceful in the fading light. 17 years ago, she had lost her sister and her family to violence and deception. The journey since had been unimaginably difficult, filled with false starts, dead ends, and heartbreaking revelations. But standing here now, surrounded by a community forever changed by that loss, she felt something she had once thought impossible: hope. As the stars appeared above Oklahoma, Stillwater continued its transformation from a town defined by tragedy to one defined by its response to tragedy. The Johnson family's story would always be part of its history, but it was no longer just a story of loss. It had become a catalyst for awareness, connection, and protection, a reminder that even the darkest chapters can lead to meaningful change. The 4 oak trees stood as living monuments, growing stronger with each passing season. Beneath them, wildflowers took root in Oklahoma soil, fragile yet resilient, just like the community that tended them. And in homes throughout Stillwater, families went about their evening routines with a heightened awareness of both the darkness that can hide behind familiar faces and the light that can emerge when a community learns to truly see one another. This was the legacy of the Johnson family, not the mystery of their disappearance or the shocking revelation of their fate, but the awakening that followed. In their absence, they had taught Stillwater its most important lesson, that safety is found not in walls or locks but in connection, awareness, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. As night fell completely, the last visitors began to leave the memorial, carrying with them the quiet determination to honor that legacy in their daily lives. Tomorrow, Stillwater would wake to another day of vigilant compassion, another opportunity to ensure that the lessons learned would protect future generations. The Johnson case was solved, but its impact continued to unfold, rippling outward from a small Oklahoma town to touch lives across the country. For in the end, the true measure of justice isn't found in courtrooms or prison cells, but in the changed behaviors and heightened awareness of those who remain. By that standard, the Johnson family had received the most profound justice of all. They had changed their world for the better. 5 years later, in July 2030, Stillwater had evolved into a community renowned for its approach to public safety and collective vigilance. What began as a response to tragedy had matured into a model studied by sociologists and law enforcement agencies nationwide. The annual gathering at Boomer Lake Park had transformed from a solemn memorial into a celebration of community resilience, drawing visitors from across Oklahoma and neighboring states. The Johnson Family Foundation, now in its 7th year, had expanded beyond its initial focus on stalking awareness to address broader aspects of community safety. Under Melissa Crawford's guidance, the foundation operated programs in 43 states, training thousands of educators, law enforcement officers, and community leaders in recognizing warning signs and fostering protective community networks. On a warm summer morning, Melissa stood at the edge of Boomer Lake, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and rose. At 57, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had transformed unimaginable loss into meaningful purpose. Behind her, the 4 oak trees that had been planted as saplings now stood tall and strong, their branches forming a natural canopy over the memorial bench. 22 years, she whispered to the morning air. "We've made it count, Sarah." Later that day, Melissa would welcome participants to the Foundation's annual leadership conference, a week-long event bringing together advocates, survivors, and experts from across the country. But first, she had come to the memorial for a private moment of reflection, a ritual she maintained despite the years that had passed. As the sun rose higher, casting dappled light through the oak leaves, Melissa heard footsteps on the path. She turned to see Detective Amber Longtree, now Chief Longtree of the Stillwater Police Department, approaching with a bouquet of wildflowers. "I thought I might find you here," Longtree said, placing the flowers beneath one of the trees. 22 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. The two women had forged a deep friendship over the years, their lives forever connected by the case that had defined both their careers. Longtree's innovative approaches to community-based policing, inspired by the Johnson case, had earned Stillwater recognition as one of the safest small cities in America. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," Melissa said, gesturing toward the town visible across the lake. "Remember what Stillwater was like right after we learned the truth? How people could barely look at each other without wondering what secrets their neighbors might be hiding." Longtree nodded. "Fear can either tear communities apart or bring them closer together. Stillwater chose the harder path, facing the fear and building something stronger because of it." Documentary filmmaker. Her work on the Johnson case had launched a career focused on knowledge. The officers listened attentively as Longtree outlined how Emma Mitchell's student documentary project had sparked the reinvestigation. For many, this aspect was the most surprising, that a film student with no law enforcement training had noticed connections that professionals had missed. "That's why we bring you to Stillwater," Longtree concluded, "rather than just teaching the case in a classroom somewhere else. Being here helps you understand the community dynamics that both concealed and ultimately revealed the truth. As the formal program began, Melissa took the podium beneath the oak trees. Behind her stood a new addition to the memorial, a wall of small ceramic tiles created by local schoolchildren, each depicting their interpretation of what makes a community safe. The colorful mosaic represented Stillwater's commitment to involving even its youngest citizens in the ongoing work of prevention and awareness. 22 years ago today, Melissa began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. My sister Sarah sensed danger approaching her family. She noticed small warning signs, patterns of attention that felt excessive, knowledge of her family's movements that seemed unnatural. She wrote in her journal that she planned to move away after returning from their trip to the lake. We all know they never made that trip. The crowd listened in respectful silence as Melissa continued, recounting not just the tragedy but the transformation that had followed. She spoke of initial suspicion giving way to collective vigilance, of fear evolving into constructive awareness, of a community learning to balance trust with appropriate caution. The Johnson legacy isn't about looking over our shoulders or suspecting our neighbors, she emphasized. It's about developing what psychologists now call protective awareness, the ability to recognize genuine warning signs without succumbing to paranoia or isolation. It's about creating communities where safety emerges from connection rather than separation. Following Melissa's address, Emma Mitchell presented a short film chronicling Stillwater's journey over the 2 decades since the case was solved. The documentary included interviews with residents who had experienced the community's transformation firsthand, intercut with footage from the memorial's evolution from a simple gathering of grieving neighbors to the vibrant educational center it had become. One particularly moving segment featured teenagers who had been born after the Johnson family's disappearance but had grown up in a town shaped by its response to the tragedy. These young people described how the principles of the Trust Your Instincts program had become integrated into their everyday lives, not as a burden of fear but as an empowering awareness. It's like learning to swim, one high school student explained on screen. At first, you're hyper-focused on every movement, every breath. But eventually, it becomes second nature. You're safer in the water without having to constantly think about drowning. This perspective, safety awareness as an intuitive skill rather than a constant state of anxiety, represented the evolution of Stillwater's approach over 2 decades. What had begun as a community reeling from betrayal had matured into one that had incorporated the lessons of that experience without being defined by its trauma. As afternoon stretched into evening, the gathering transitioned to its final phase, the traditional planting of wildflowers around the memorial. What had started as a symbolic act of renewal had developed into an annual refresh of the natural garden surrounding the oak trees. Children worked alongside elders, visitors joined locals, each person adding a small contribution to the collective beauty. Daniel Foster stood slightly apart, watching the scene with visible emotion. Longtree approached, offering him a seedling. "Still hard for you, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Foster nodded. "Every anniversary, I think about how different things might have been if I'd spoken up sooner about what I saw at the hardware store that night. If I'd trusted my instincts instead of dismissing them." Longtree placed a hand on his shoulder. "And every anniversary, I remind you that you did eventually speak up. You held on to that memory for 14 years and shared it when it mattered. That's part of why we're all here today." Her words captured another aspect of Stillwater's healing, learning to forgive not just others but themselves for not seeing sooner what later seemed obvious. The community had come to understand that hindsight creates an illusion of clarity that isn't available in the moment. As twilight descended, small solar lights illuminated the memorial path, creating a gentle glow around the gathering. Someone began to sing, a tradition that had emerged spontaneously years earlier and now formed a cherished part of the ceremony. Others joined in, voices blending in a simple melody that spoke of hope emerging from darkness. Melissa Crawford stood among her neighbors, feeling the familiar mixture of grief and gratitude that these anniversaries always evoked. The pain of losing her sister and her family had never fully disappeared, but it had been transformed, channeled into purpose, into connection, into change that reached far beyond Stillwater's boundaries. As the singing concluded, people began to disperse, moving in small groups toward the parking areas or back into town. Melissa remained by the memorial bench, joined by Emma and Longtree. The three women had developed a tradition of sharing a quiet moment together after the public ceremonies concluded. "I received a letter this morning," Melissa said, breaking the companionable silence. "From a woman in Arizona whose daughter was being stalked by a coworker. She said they'd attended one of the foundation's workshops last year, and because of what they learned, they recognized the warning signs early. They documented everything, involved authorities, and prevented what police believe could have become a violent situation." Emma nodded. "That's the 37th documented case this year where the program directly contributed to prevention. The actual number is probably much higher, those are just the ones we know about." Longtree added, "The ripple effect is impossible to measure fully. How do you count the crimes that never happened because someone spoke up early? How do you quantify the harm prevented when a community notices concerning patterns before they escalate?" This immeasurable impact represented the true fulfillment of what they had worked to build, not just a response to one family's tragedy but a fundamental shift in how communities approach prevention. The Johnson legacy lived in these invisible successes, in the stories they would never hear because danger had been recognized and addressed before tragedy could occur. As night fell completely, the three women walked together toward the parking area, their path lit by the gentle glow of the memorial lights. Behind them, the 4 oak trees stood as living monuments, their branches moving slightly in the evening breeze, 4 distinct entities grown from individual saplings, now forming a unified presence that offered both shelter and strength. 22 years after the Johnson family's disappearance, Stillwater had transformed their memory from a wound into a wellspring, a source of wisdom that continued to nourish and protect. The community had discovered that the most fitting memorial wasn't found in stone or bronze but in the living practice of vigilance without fear, connection without naivety, and care without obsession. As Melissa drove home through the familiar streets, she passed houses where lights glowed warmly in windows, families visible inside going about their evening routines. These glimpses of ordinary life, the very ordinariness her sister's family had been denied, represented the ultimate achievement of their work. Stillwater's children grew up safer not because they lived in fear but because they belonged to a community that had learned to see clearly. In her home office, Melissa paused before a photograph of Sarah and her family, the last Christmas picture taken before their disappearance. Their smiling faces had once brought only pain, now they inspired continued purpose. She touched the frame gently, a gesture repeated thousands of times over the years. "We've built something that matters," she whispered to the image. "Something that will outlast all of us." The next morning, as sunlight streamed through her kitchen window, Melissa prepared for the Foundation's leadership conference. Representatives from community safety programs across the country would spend the next 5 days in Stillwater, learning from the town's experience and sharing their own insights. What had begun as one sister's determination to find justice had evolved into a movement, a collaborative effort to create communities where preventable tragedies became increasingly rare. The work wasn't finished, it never would be. But each year brought new advancements in understanding, new tools for awareness, new stories of successful intervention. As Melissa gathered her materials for the day's opening session, her phone chimed with a message. It was from Emma Mitchell, sending a preview clip from her anniversary documentary. The brief video showed aerial footage of Stillwater at dawn, the camera slowly zooming in on Boomer Lake Park where the 4 oak trees stood distinct yet connected, a living symbol of the Johnson family's enduring influence. The final shot focused on the inscription on Sarah's memorial bench, the words that had become Stillwater's guiding principle: "Trust your instincts." Simple words that had transformed a community's understanding of safety, connection, and collective responsibility. Melissa watched the clip twice, emotion rising in her throat. The journey from unimaginable loss to meaningful legacy had been long and often painful. There had been days when grief threatened to overwhelm purpose, when the weight of absence seemed unbearable. But standing on the far side of those 22 years, she could see clearly what they had built together, not just a memorial to lives lost, but a framework for lives protected. As she drove toward the conference center, Melissa passed the elementary school where Sarah had once taught. The building had been renovated over the years, but a mosaic near the entrance, designed by Sarah's former students, now adults with children of their own, remained a colorful reminder of her creative spirit. Inside, the Trust Your Instincts program was integrated into the curriculum at every grade level, teaching age-appropriate awareness skills from kindergarten through 5th grade. Arriving at the conference center, Melissa found the main hall already buzzing with activity. Program directors from across the country compared notes on implementation challenges and successes. Law enforcement officers discussed the integration of community awareness programs with traditional policing approaches. Researchers presented data on prevention outcomes and evolving best practices. This gathering represented another dimension of the Johnson legacy, a professional community dedicated to translating Stillwater's hard-won wisdom into adaptable frameworks for diverse communities. What had begun as one town's response to tragedy had evolved into a nationwide movement, with Stillwater serving as both origin point and ongoing laboratory. As Melissa moved through the crowd, she was struck by how many unfamiliar faces surrounded her. The work had grown beyond her personal connections, beyond those who remembered the Johnson family directly. It had taken on a life of its own, carried forward by people who knew the story primarily as a case study rather than a lived experience. There was something profoundly hopeful in this realization. The work would continue even when those who remembered Sarah, Robert, Emma, and Lily personally were no longer there to share their memories. The lessons would endure, embedded in programs, policies, and community practices designed to prevent similar tragedies. When Melissa took the podium to welcome the participants, she began not with the story of loss but with the story of transformation, how Stillwater had channeled grief into constructive change, how vigilance had become not a burden but a shared value, how safety had emerged from connection rather than isolation. 22 years ago, she concluded, my sister wrote in her journal that something didn't feel right. Today, thousands of people across this country are alive and safe because they listened to similar feelings and had clear pathways for response. That is the true measure of justice, not just accountability for past harm, but prevention of future suffering. The applause that followed wasn't just for her words but for the collective journey they had taken, a journey from darkness to light, from tragedy to purpose, from individual loss to community strength. As Melissa looked out over the gathering, she saw not just colleagues but fellow travelers on a path toward a world where fewer families would experience what hers had endured. Outside, the summer sun shone on a town transformed not by forgetting its darkest chapter but by learning from it. Stillwater would always carry the memory of the Johnson family, but it had refused to be defined by how they were lost. Instead, it had chosen to be defined by what their loss had taught, that safety grows from awareness, that protection emerges from connection, and that even the deepest wounds can become sources of healing for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.